This table I'm leaning over.
Hello. I have to use this really large microphone, which is a little bit awkward. Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. We're streaming through that camera there. I don't know how many people have joined, but it's nice to have that hybrid mixture. So whether you are in Bristol or far away, you can join in the conversation. My name is Vanessa. I'm dressed all in black and standing in front of a large screen with the speakers. So every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 until 5. The talks cover everything from innovative research in fields of creativity and technology to projects in progress, which are in need of feedback, questions, and curious minds. An especially big welcome to people who haven't engaged with the studio before, and for who this might be the first time, so welcome. So a little bit about the Pervasive Media Studio. We are a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. It's a partnership between Watershed, the University of Bristol and the University of the West of England. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities to our residents as part of our spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. With space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make time for collaboration. So I'm going to do a little bit of quick housekeeping. Obviously, feel free to move around. It's quite packed. It's going to be quite hard to move around, but of course, feel free to move around. Make a cup of tea or grab some water in the kitchen over there if you haven't already. We have a quiet space just behind this wall here if you need to take some time out, away from the hustle and bustle. We have fire exits at either end of the studio where you came in and through the back here. And if there is a fire alarm, it's not a drill. So please follow my colleagues. We've got accessible toilets and baby change facilities through that little corridor next to the kitchen. There's a Q&A at the end of the talk. So for those of you watching online, you can pop your questions in the chat next to the YouTube window. And if you're in the building, obviously, just raise your hand. So you can get news on all our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. Right, so today is the second in a month-long takeover by Watershed's research team. I'm in the research team. Some of us are in the audience here, and some of them, and Martin, Faraha, and some of us are online. So online, please give a wave to those who are online. This talk is also directly linked to a brilliant program we are part of called MyWorld, which is a project led by the University of Bristol that will, over the next 4 years, amplify and celebrate the West of England's reputation as an international trailblazer in creative technology and screen-based media. But I am super excited now to introduce Professors Danae Stanton Fraser and Iain Gilchrist, who will take you on a journey through the different methods of audience evaluation for performances and what the future might look like in that space. We are hoping this will really provoke a lively discussion with you all at the end. So let's get to it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So, yeah, I'm Danae Stanton Fraser. I'm a professor in human-computer interaction at the University of Bath in the psychology department and involved in the MyWorld project, as Vanessa said. I lead a lab called the Create Lab, and we look at the design and evaluation of technologies and the behaviours of people who use technologies. We've collaborated with the Pervasive Media Studio over many years now, which has been fantastic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some projects we've done and our approach. And I'm also collaborating with my colleague here, Iain Gilchrist, on the AHRC cluster, which is the Pervasive Media Studio is part of, and the MyWorld project that Vanessa just mentioned. I'll pass over to Iain.
So I'm Iain Gilchrist. I'm Professor of Neuropsychology at the University of Bristol. Neuropsychology is bringing together the study of the mind and understanding the physical basis for that within the brain. I'm involved in Bristol Vision Institute, which is based at the University of Bristol, but brings together a community across the Bristol area who are interested in vision science, how we see effectively, and leading together we're leading the MyWorld component on understanding audiences, and that's partly why we're here. So I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to take a seat, I think.
Yes, you can take a seat. I'm doing the first part of the talk. I mean, one of the nice things that we've done recently over the last 2 projects is build up a team between the 2 universities so that we're collaborating and sharing resources, and obviously as part of the broader teams of our projects. So that's why we're presenting together on this. So I've said who I am, and I'm going to talk. It's going to be quite a short talk, so about half an hour. We sort of want to cover what our approach is to studying audiences and studying people's behaviour. We're going to touch on some of the types of data that we collect or we could collect. Ian's going to talk a bit about sampling and some projects that they've carried out at Bristol. And then the main aim of our MyWorld project is to try and develop this toolkit of methods that we can use to analyse audiences. And to use that, and when I say analyse audiences, it might be that audiences get that feedback for themselves. It might be that you feedback that to performers who can then use that in real time to engage with the performance. So it's not about us just capturing audiences, it's about that interaction. And we're particularly interested in all sorts of analysis of audiences, but particularly sort of in the moment, capturing when they're actually engaged in some sort of activity. So I'm going to talk just firstly, and it's just quite broad brush, about our approach. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're saying when we say audience, because obviously how you define audience is quite different, and ours is quite general. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some types of projects and some of the concepts that we look at as psychologists in this area. So we look at all different types of audiences. So when I'm saying audience, I'm using it very broadly. So a lot of my work is looking at individual people experiencing sort of creative products. So it might be, for example, I do a lot of work I'm particularly interested in virtual reality and mixed reality environments. So it might be that I'm thinking about an audience as somebody who comes along, sees an environment, a creative environment, so a 360 video piece of something creative in a headset. And I do a lot of work looking at people's interactions using VR. We're also thinking about people who are screen-based, and Ian's going to talk about some people who, some studies looking at screens, not VR. And we're also thinking about audiences who are individual, but also groups of people interacting together. So basically, our audience that we're talking about is quite broad brush as an audience. So what are the sort of things we study? Now, if I was sort of covering everything we studied, it would take me like the whole afternoon to talk about it. So what I thought I'd do is just mention a few examples of the types of concepts that we look at and just give an example study for each of those. So some of the things that I'm going to cover are synchrony. So we might look at how audience synchronize and what we can look at in terms of that synchrony and how that might affect the content. I'm going to talk a little bit about identity, so how you identify with the people in the creative piece or the performer and what that might mean. And then briefly immersion, which is a big concept, particularly in VR and in screen-based and immersive tech, and basically how people are immersed in the content and can we measure how people are engaged or immersed in that content. So those are just some of the concepts we're looking at, and I'm just going to give you a few examples. So the first example here is around synchrony. And I was part of a fabulous project with Mandy Rose, who some of you know from the studio, from UE, and Key Cater from the University of Bristol. And we had this project, we were looking at a 360 documentary. And we did a whole number of studies within this, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of those to sort of outline the concepts that I'm talking about. So one of those studies was looking at synchrony. We led the experimental work package, so a lot of ours were studies around how people were viewing these types of content. So in this particular study, we were looking at people viewing 360 content through a headset. So it's an audience who are viewing through a virtual reality headset. they're viewing a 360 environment, so they can't interact with it, but they can view it by turning around, and it's surrounding them, and they can move 360. And what we were particularly interested in, we did lots and lots of studies around empathy and prejudice and all sorts of things, but in this particular bit, we were looking at synchrony. And so what we were doing was we were tracking people's head movements as they moved within the display and interacted and watched the 360 video, which is called Clouds Over Sidra, and it's about a refugee camp, and Sidra takes you through the refugee camp, and it sort of shows you it in about a 6-minute video. The interesting bit for that is the sort of measures that you can take. So we were taking all sorts of questionnaire measures, we were taking people's behaviours as they were watching, but the thing that we were looking at here was synchrony. So where do people synchronise? Now remember, they're in a VR headset, and we've got lots of different people in VR headsets looking about. But are there ways that they synchronise that can tell us something about the content, that can help, for example, film producers who've moved into this medium think about the ways that they might create the content in order to make the narrative really good for the person observing it. And we found really interesting things around how people synchronise, for example, at the start of scenes, that there were particular types of scenes, so when they were unidirectional, that they were more likely to synchronise. And so this synchronicity was enabling us to think about how audiences are engaged and what you might do to engage them further, or actually you might not want to do, you might not want them to, especially in 360 video, because if you can imagine, you can miss things. If they happen to be happening behind you, you might be looking this way and actually miss something that's going on. So that's just an example of sort of one concept, and there are lots and lots of other studies of synchrony. I'm just using one of ours as an example, but that's one of the things that we're studying. So audience synchrony, and that's an example from VR, but we might be looking at audience synchrony when people are sitting like this listening to the talk, for example. The second example I'm going to give you, again, is from the Virtual Realities project. And this is a different type of example. So it's 360 video, but we're particularly interested in identity and empathy in this one. And so what we did was I think I'll talk a bit about the process, actually, because it's quite interesting. So for the first one I just mentioned, we'd just taken a creative piece that had already been created, and we used it to analyse synchrony. In this, we used a different type of process, and I will link back to this later on. So we actually we commissioned this piece with Victoria Mappelbeck, joined us in the team. She was the film creator and director, not us, but she developed this piece, and we had workshops, and we worked in a sort of design process where we fed into the piece as well. We showcased it, so it went to the Venice Film Festival and the Amsterdam Film Festival, and it's a fantastic piece, 360, about Victoria's journey through her breast cancer and her radiotherapy. Now, the exciting thing for us about this was that we were part of that process, but then we get to study this piece. So this study's just been finished. It was delayed because of COVID, but basically what we did was we then studied how, wanted to look at if people identify with Victoria, does that make a difference to their behaviours, what they might do? So we studied this in an experimental design where we had participants come along, and half of them were sitting as you normally do when using a display, and half of them were lying down. So they were in the same position as Victoria was in within the environment. And that was one of the manipulations, but we also looked at if people identified with Victoria, so that was questionnaire based after they'd had the experience, whether they were more likely to do things like breast examinations or think more about health care. We just completed that study and found that people do feel more spatial presence when they're lying down, and so in the same position. We also found that people who identify with Victoria also report, so remember this is self-report, that they're more likely to do examinations following, and particularly if they report they've got relatives who've had the types of cancer. So there's interesting things that we can look at around empathy. This actually is looking at sort of a little bit of behaviour change and health outcomes as well. So that's another example of sort of a different process to how we've worked, and also the sort of things that we're looking at. So that was more empathy and identity. And my final example here is about immersion. Immersion is a big topic that we look at. And I'm just going to give one example. So through the cluster, the HRC creative cluster that we work on with the Watershed, we were lucky enough that Sleep Dogs let us use one of their pieces to explore during COVID. And this is working with Iain, who's going to be talking to you in a minute, and Anna, who's in the audience. And we've been developing an online tool. So we've got a whole audience online who are viewing this piece, and we're then analysing their movements, so recording them and analysing how they move. And very briefly, what we're doing is we're looking whether how much they move, so if they're more still, does that predict their immersion? Then we've got questionnaires of narrative engagement and things like that. So that's another way of exploring audience behaviour and audience engagement. So those are just 3 of the core concepts we're looking at. There are lots of others, I can name lots of others, but those are 3. So synchrony, identity and empathy, and immersion. Now, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the types of data that we're looking at as well. So we're looking at a whole variety of types of data. And in the MyWorld project, which we'll mention a little bit more at the end, we're thinking about how you might put all of these data sets together into sort of some toolkit, which would be partly what's already out there from academia, from the creative industries, and partly, hopefully, that we'll input to that over the few years of the project. So when we're talking about the types of things, thank Hugo, because he works with Iain, who did this slide for me. You might think about self-reports. So I've mentioned questionnaires. It might be focus groups. It might be interviews. You might look, and Ian's going to be talking about attention in a minute, and you might look at, my first example of the head tracking. You might look at attention and attentional synchrony, or Iain looks at dual task reaction times in some of his studies. You might look at heart rate, so we've done things where you look at heart rate, physiological responses during the performance, or, for example, brain activity, which I haven't done as much of, but there's more Iain's and Bristol side. And then, other things. So, for example, in a lot of studies, I've looked at memory. So we've looked at, do people in 360, for example, remember things that they might not when they look at something on a flat screen? Does that then transfer? Can you do a delayed response if you test them later? Does that happen? So those are sort of different ways that we might think very quickly about our toolkit. There might be many others that we haven't covered there. And then I'm just going to say a few words about, what we do with this data. So as you'll probably have picked up from the studies, we don't tend to just have one data set. So we don't just do interviews, or in most of our studies, that's not everyone, but we tend to try and triangulate our data. So we try and look at how somebody's responding behaviourally, a self-report as well, and maybe an interview, or all sorts of different data to really try and get at what we're trying to get at. So that might be our broader research question, or it might be really specific. It might be immersion, and we want to capture lots of things so that we can really tell if what we're finding is what we're really finding. Because if we're just one data source, that's quite hard. So often we use this sort of triangulation of data. That might be quantitative data, it might be statistics, or it might be qualitative, and that varies across the studies. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll give Iain plenty of time to talk. So I'll just go on to a few challenges. I've got loads, but I'll just mention a few. So perhaps if I start, so that image is Anka from our lab, and she's actually this was part of an experiment. And as you can see, there's like sort of loads of paper things and somebody in a VR headset. And I've experienced this quite a few times. So, for example, at the Amsterdam Film Festival, when we were viewing amazing VR pieces, and then you come out of it and somebody gives you a paper questionnaire and asks you how you felt about the experience. And you're thinking, like this. And we do it too, sometimes. So how do you deliver those questionnaires? This is just like, in the simplest way. Lots of us use questionnaires and those sort of things. But how do we deliver them? Do we deliver them at the time of the experience? Can we integrate them in some way? So Anka in her PhD has been trying to, when she finishes an experience, she's designing very personalised avatars, and she's put the responses in the VR headset, but that's limiting. You've got a standardised questionnaire that's got 15 questions. You can't put that in the headset, so you can only put 1 or 2 questions. How do you think about these, how not just the data you're collecting, but when you get that data from people, and how sensible it is, and how you're how you're carrying out that data collection? Oh, I haven't put another slide for that. The second thing I think that's really important is to think about the different measures. So I can't go into detail, but if you're measuring heart rate, it's actually really hard to know what heart rate is measuring because arousal could be for a whole number of reasons. There could be a whole number of emotions. So unless you triangulate your data, like I was suggesting, it's quite hard to tell. And I know Iain mentioned a bit about heart rate as well. And the same with Empatica wristbands. They're quite hard to synchronize, even though that they're used for synchrony. There's lots and lots of issues we come up with. And I think one that's really struck me during the cluster that we're working on is we're working with lots of theatres and small companies, and they're doing really exciting things. So they are handing out questionnaires and doing things like that, just as we do, but they're also doing things like integrating wearables into their performances, thinking about real-time interaction with audiences. There's a real problem with data storage, and it might sound a bit boring, but actually it's really important because people want to feel their data is private, and that in that space when if they're giving up some data, that actually they know that that's really being looked after. And in large institutions, that's encrypted and thought about, but in small institutions, it's actually quite hard. Where you haven't got the systems for that. So thinking how we manage all of that is actually quite important as well. Excuse me. Now, I have talked for quite a bit, so I'm going to pass over to Iain to talk about sampling, and then I'm coming back to just quickly talk about the toolkit before the end. Over to you, Iain.
So, change of speaker. You'll be pleased to hear there'll always be a speaker standing up because we've only got one chair to share. There's no way out here. There'll always be one of us. So I thought at this point I would talk a little bit about sampling. Sounds like a boring topic, but the reason we're talking about it is because we want to relate it to something that's really practical and what's happening right now in measuring audience experience in Bristol amongst the various organisations there are in Bristol. In Bristol, amongst various organisations that I attend to enjoy performances and come to the theatre and go to cinema, etc., the classic thing to do is to send out a questionnaire in some form or another. That's what most people do. We're thinking about the future, but we also, as part of this toolkit we're developing, need to think about the present. So I'm going to say a little bit about questionnaires and some of the pitfalls of that, and hopefully for those of you who are kind of working in this space, that will throw up some questions about your own practice and maybe lead you to asking me questions about your own practice, and that's fine. So this is a slightly different kind of pitch, I suppose. So, as I said, most people are doing surveys, and the sorts of questions you want to ask really are, what did you think of my show? What did you think of the performance? Did you enjoy it? You might even want to ask, did you think it was worth the money you paid for it? Will you come back to another one? Those sorts of questions. Of course, it's completely reasonable to not care about your audience. You might say, I've created this artifact, I'm putting it in the middle of the room, and I don't care if you like it or hate it. I accept that. But if you are interested in what your audience has to say, then you may well have a way of doing that. And one of the things to do is to send out a questionnaire. So I'm going to try and walk you through some of the pitfalls of questionnaires, just a few of them, not all of them, just to provoke some discussion maybe later on. And in doing that, I'm going to create a kind of toy world in which there's a questionnaire. It is a toy world. It has its limitations, but hopefully it'll allow me to illustrate the points I'm trying to make. And I want you to imagine a situation where you're putting on an event, a performance, and there are 100 people in your audience. Here are your 100 people. They are diverse and heterogeneous. And what you want to know from them with your questionnaire is just a single question. We're going to make life simple for ourselves by asking a single question. And the single question we're going to ask is, did you like the show? Okay? Were you engaged in it if you like, but did you like it? Now, amongst this audience that we've mocked up, we're in the lucky position that 50% of them will answer that question yes, and 50% answer no. So the yes people are in green and the no people are in red. And that's actually what the audience think. We know that because it's a fake audience. We can make it up. We don't have to ask them. I've made them up for them. So what might you do? Well, practice across the whole of the sector, and even in Bristol, is to think, well, we better send an email out to some people and ask them what they thought, okay? And you've probably got the email address of not everyone who was in the audience, But those of you who've got, you send an email enthusiastically and you say, can you reply to this email and answer my simple question, did you like the show? Okay, now, one of the consequences of that is, even if you have got the email address of everybody in the audience, there will be a bias in who responds. Okay, and in my fake world, the bias is affecting the children who are in your audience, because many of them won't have access to email. And actually, we know that older people in our community are less likely to respond to emails as well, or less likely to have full access to email. The illusion that we've all got smartphones is an illusion amongst people like me, I guess. So we drop out those people, and in this lucky world that I've created, they all reply. You know, they all come back with an answer. I know, strange, isn't it? That's not going to happen. But of these people that are left, 64% say they like the show. Okay, so we've already introduced a bias in our sample, haven't we? We've not got a representative response straight away. Let's go back to our audience. This is the audience who we know about. 50% of them like the show. And because you're worried about your questionnaire now, so well, what I'm going to do is I've got the audience. They're all going to turn up to my live event. I'm going to capture them. I'm going to capture them in the foyer afterwards. Okay, this is my chance to capture them. And I'm going to ask all the people who are in the foyer my question, and then I'm going to note it down, and then it's all going to be fine, and I'll have solved my problem. Unfortunately, and this is me being harsh, wheelchair access to the foyer isn't very good. So all those people didn't make it to the foyer because there's not a lift. And also, those with young children who've had to go home to bail out the babysitter. The kids have got school tomorrow, so they've gone. And the older people are also worried about getting a bus back, so some of them aren't going back. Remember, this is a toy world I've created. Hopefully it's not as bad as that. But now, 82% of the people in the foyer are saying, yes, I like the show, which is a long way away from the 50%. Okay, so again, it's another bias we've introduced. Now, I'm not saying that asking people in the foyer is a bad thing, and I'm not saying sending emails is a bad thing. What I'm saying is we need to be extremely careful about the biases we introduce in how we sample the people that we ask the questions of. So we're back with 100 people, and we know 50% like the show. We're now in a state of chaos and concern, and we just say, well, I'm just going to ask my friends. So you ask your friends, and your friends are a really nice, diverse group. You know, you're a lovely person, so you've got this diverse group of people. You know some old people, you know some kids who are at the show. You ask those people. But of course, 100% of them say to you, yeah, no, I loved the show. It was great. You know, I really, really liked it. And they may really like it. There's two reasons they might say that. The first reason is they might say that because they really did like it, because they're a bit like you, and you put on the show, and you're involved in the show, and they're your kind of people. That's not very good, is it? But also, there's a social bias there, isn't there? You know, they're thinking, oh, it's my friend, and they're asking about the show, and I know they've spent the last 6 months on it. I'm a bit nervous to say no. Oh, yes, I did like it. Okay, and that's a problem, isn't it? So there's two biases coming in there, two subtly different biases, which can have an impact in various places. So this is the point at which you panic and you say, okay, so I've got this problem that my bias is. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask as many people as I possibly can, and that will fix my problem. As long as I get my response rate up, because we also know that it's unlikely that everyone's going to reply to the email. As long as I get my response rate up, everything will be fine. So the second question is about sample size. How many people do I need to ask? Okay? This is conceptually difficult for me to get across, so if you smile, I will keep going, okay? That's my plan. So imagine you do a survey, and really what you want to ask is how many people do I need to ask to get a response back to my questions somewhere between 40 and 60%. Okay, so we've still got this audience of 100 people, and we're saying, I want to do my survey, and it's not going to be perfect if I don't ask everybody, but I want to know roughly in the right ballpark, so between 40 and 60% responses, because that will tell me whether roughly people like my show. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for. Now, because this is a fake world, you know, it's a toy world that I've made up and we're playing with, what I can do is I can do a computer simulation, and I can do the survey 10,000 times, okay? Never be able to do that in the real world, but I can do it 10,000 times. It's a computer simulation. And I can do that simulation. I can say, well, what will happen in all those 10,000 surveys that I carry out? You with me so far? Okay. So if I go into my 100 people in the audience and I just ask 12 people in that audience, key point here, I ask 12 people randomly. I don't pick my friends. I randomly select 12 people to ask. If I do that, and I do that survey 10,000 times, 61% of the surveys will give me a result between 40 and 60%. So actually I get quite a good idea of what my audience think by just asking 12 people. As long as they're picked randomly, not your friends, not the people who look friendly, not the people in the foyer, not via email, randomly pick them and follow them up. And actually, if you just increase it a bit to 32 people, 87% of your surveys are going to give you a result between 40 and 60%. So what that means intuitively is that you don't have to ramp your numbers up to get stable estimates of what your audience are thinking. You just need to randomly sample them. You need to genuinely go after the people who are in your sample and make sure you get a response from all of them. Okay. So some of that might be lost, but bias is really serious. Okay. If you're biased in who you ask questions to, you're not going to get an answer back about what your audience think that's representative. And that has really serious implications for inclusivity and diversity, of course. The size of your sample is less important. As long as that sample's random, as long as you're genuinely getting a random sample from your audience, you can find out really important things and stable estimates of what your audience are thinking by taking a subsample. Okay? So bias is bad, smaller sample size not so bad. Okay, and that's what I wanted to get across. Okay, so next section. I like this section 4, 5, 6, 7 because you can see how far we are to the final station. It's like travelling on the tube, isn't it? We're now on platform 4. We've got 3 more to go before the end. So we're now going to talk a little bit about ways to test technology. So really practical question. This is a screen-based thing. This is a study I did with part of my team. So the question is, you go into John Lewis or Curry's or something, and you're going to buy a new telly. Okay, quite an expensive outlay. Some of you have already done that during lockdown. I certainly increased my telly size from this big to this big. You go in to buy a new telly, and there's lots of stickers all over everything telling you about the new technology that's within those new televisions. And the newer technology is going to be more expensive than the cheaper technology and less good technology. Now, 2 pieces of technology you'll see if you go in to buy a new television at the moment. You'll be offered changes in the definition. So that's the number of pixels that there are on the screen. And typically you'll be offered a high definition television or an ultra high definition television. I'm not sure what they're going to do after ultra, because that's it, isn't it? They've gone for the maximum. So that's one option you'll have. And the other option you'll have is about the dynamic range. And the dynamic range is how bright the brightest thing on the screen is compared to the darkness of the screen. Okay, the darkest thing that the screen can do is produce is when it's turned off, actually. So when you think your TV's grey, it can't ever get darker than that grey. But that's the dynamic range, so the brightest to the darkest colour. Okay, and in dynamic range you get standard dynamic range and high dynamic range, and obviously high dynamic range they've left space to get ultra high dynamic range at some point in the future, which we'll all pay more money for. Okay, so you're in the TV shop, you've got these options and you've got the prices for these different things, and you want to know which television to buy. And really the question you're asking, I think, is you're asking, I want to buy the television that's going to get me most immersed, so that when I'm sitting watching that television, I'm really even more in the event, in the moment of that performance or production or whatever it is you're watching. What might that mean? Well, one way to think about that, and we probably have all had this sort of experience, is when you're really immersed in content, television content for instance, that's the circumstances where you completely ignore everything else in the room. The sun sets, you forget to eat, you become dehydrated, you neglect your children or members of your family, the sort of world falls apart around you, but you're so immersed in what's going on. So that's what we're trying to measure. Not obviously the neglect of the children, that would be too much. But, so how we operationalise that is we ask people to watch television, and occasionally they're sitting there, and you'll see in a minute in this picture, they're sitting there with a little button box on their lap, and occasionally there's going to be a bleep, okay, which is not relevant to the content, and as soon as there's a bleep, you've got to press the button, okay? If they're really immersed, they're going to pay less attention to the bleep, and they're going to miss it. A bit like you might miss somebody coming and saying, it's time for tea, and what? What did he say? Okay, so, and what we measure is we measure the time it takes people to press that button to that bleep. Okay, and that measures how immersed they are in the content compared to how much they're monitoring the rest of the world. Okay, so here's somebody actually doing that. There's them with their button box. They're also having galvanic skin response measured, so they're having the kind of sweatiness of the hand measured at the same time, and they're watching an episode of Killing Eve. I'm going to summarise this quickly. Here's the graph for it with real data. Turns out, and so what we've got on this axis is reaction time. So the time it took people to press that button when it went bleep. On this axis, we've got the different kinds of displays. Okay? And what we find is there isn't a difference between high definition and ultra high definition. Okay? That doesn't make you more immersed. But the dynamic range, so how bright the bright is compared to the dark, that does make a difference. And that's that step up you can see here in reaction time. People are slower to respond here to the bleep when it happens than down here. And just to come back to something Danae said, this is us triangulating, okay? Doing that thing. We're doing other measures at the same time to see, is this picking up on the same thing? Okay, so this section is going to be a little bit more about that triangulation thing. As I said 2 sections ago, platform 7, lots of the standard practice in a way in this field is to use questionnaires. Often, there's lots of things going on, but one of the things that people often do is use questionnaires. And we, in this work particularly, we want to kind of get beyond the questionnaires because we want to see how people's immersion or engagement fluctuates second by second as they watch content. Is there a moment where everyone gets together and everyone's engaged, and there are moments where people are starting to look around the room and get distracted by the kids or whatever it is. Okay, so we're interested in that fluctuation. Also, one of the things we worry about with questionnaires is it's based on memory, because I have this beautiful experience, and then afterwards you ask me to fill in a questionnaire, I might forget something about my own experience. So we want to get at that sort of the microstructure, the moment-by-moment fluctuation. Okay, so in this case, we're using a very standard questionnaire. You don't need to know about the detail of it, which measures people's immersion, how much they feel really engaged with content. And what we did, this again worked with the BBC, what we did is we took little 5-minute clips of very different content. So you can see here some examples of it. Gardener's World. The fishing thing, which I love, that's my favourite, and the PhD student who works with me on this thinks it's the worst thing in the world. There are individual differences for you. And other content. So we had these little clips of those, participants watch the little clips, and then they fill in the questionnaire. And during the little clip, we take these other measurements. Okay? So the first example I'm going to give you is the one you've heard about already. So this is when the bleep happens and you have to press the button, and we say that if you're more immersed in the content, you're slower at pressing the button. Okay? And here's a graph showing our different bits of content. They're all listed here. And here's the average rating from our participants on that questionnaire. And here's the average reaction time when they have to respond to that bleep. And you can see that there's a relationship between the two, which is great news for us, isn't it? We're very pleased about that. And what you can see is that for our participants, on average, for the more engaging content, like Line of Duty, that they report in the questionnaire they're more engaged, but also they are slower in the reaction time. Okay, so this is the triangulation process. This is taking one type of measure and making it linked to another kind of measure and seeing that we're kind of converging on the same thing. Okay? And sadly for me, gone fishing rate's very low. So fools, all of them. So I said a little bit about triangulation. Here's a different kind of measure. This is heart rate. So we're measuring heart rate in those little. So they watch these little snippets of these different programs. We measure their heart rate during the snippet, and then we do the questionnaire. Here's that narrative engagement questionnaire. These are different snippets now, because we wanted variety. We didn't want our experiment to necessarily depend on the exact snippets we've chosen. And here's a heart rate measure. Now this heart rate measure is the inter-subject correlation between our participants. So it's not just how fast your heart is beating, it's It's that my heart is beating in synchrony with you when you watched it on another day. Okay? Weird. So it's a heart rate measure and narrative engagement. You say again, we find this really strong relationship. And you know, the wild gardener is at the very bottom with low synchronization in heart rate and low narrative engagement score, and something else. Crazy Rich Asians does very well for some reason in both this heart rate and the narrative engagement score. Okay. So there's just a few examples of how we're doing the triangulation process, the kinds of things we're interested in, the range of measures that we're kind of engaged in. We're interested in questionnaires, we're interested in interviews, we're interested in qualitative methods, but we're all the way through to taking careful physiological measures which allow us to track the changes moment by moment in people's response to content. And we want to unlock that possibility so that people working in the creative industries can have access to those data so that they can begin to use them both to inform them about how people are responding to their content, but also maybe change the content. So there's one seat and I'm going to sit in it now.
Okay. So Iain's given you a tour of some of the things that we do, and I mentioned some of the VR, we talked about some of the screen-based, and all I'm going to do now is just highlight where we're hoping to go with this work. So we're working on a number of studies, you can see, in all sorts of with different audiences, using different methods, and what we'd like to do during MyWorld is pull together a toolkit. So the aim is that we would create this toolkit that involves things so first of all, we'll survey the area. We're doing that now. So we're doing a review of the academic literature. We're going to do a review of how creative industries are using all sorts of mechanisms to look at their audiences. And then we are going to pull that together, do some studies ourselves and integrate those as well. So we're going to look at questionnaires and how they're designed, and maybe look at developing new ones that are being more appropriate, putting a website up where we can people can come and get information, or maybe we're thinking about how people can delve into what we've got and use it for their own practice. And it might be that some places just want to, they think, well, I just want to do a focus group and I want to think about how to do that, or I want to be careful about bias in my sample. But it might be that other people want to work with us in a process, and I mentioned that we work in both ways, and a process that would be really great to work with some industry partners, and we've got some connected to our work package, but we want to reach out much wider in order to, for somebody doing interactive theatre, can we integrate something with them that maybe includes physiological responses? And as part of that programme, we're developing a technology, like a seat, which sounds a bit weird, but Iain's going to talk more about the actual structure of it, but we are developed so we can, thank you. So we can, that's very kind, thank you. Yeah, I haven't spoken this much for ages, so sorry. So that we can create maybe in your chair, you could be sitting there and you'd have like something like a Empatica wristband that's measuring your physiological response while we're talking. You could have a tablet that you're able to interact on in some ways. Maybe it's your questionnaires, maybe that's not the best way to do your questionnaires. Like a setup. But that's mobile. So the idea is that we can use that in the lab. We could come to the Watershed cinema and use that setup, and we can rearrange that setup and think about the methods, all these different types of methods that we use. And we're going to have an infrastructure that we can test that Iain's going to talk about. Oh, and I've missed also look at online interaction. So, when I mentioned that we're looking at how we're exploring how people view things online, see if we can take measures of that. In a way that really gives interesting input to the audiences themselves and to the people who are, perhaps they're watching their performances or something like that. So that toolkit is our aim over the next few years, and we're hoping that we'll interact with many of you as we develop that toolkit. Pass to Iain for the last word on the rest of that.
Okay, so I thought it was worth just saying something about the facilities that are going to be delivered under MyWorld, and this is significant, really exciting. I'm really excited about it. I can see Oscar in the room and he looks nervous about it, but it's going to happen, okay? So some of you might not know this, so I just thought I'd give you just 30 seconds about what's happening. So this top corner here, hopefully you can see where the cursor is. This is Temple Mead Station. And if you are travelling to Bath or London at the moment, sitting on your train looking out across the Barron building site, what you'll see is actual work going on a pair of buildings that are adjoined, which are going to be a new facility specifically for Bristol Digital Futures, which will include facilities for MyWorld, okay, and MyWorld to support exactly the work we've been talking about. And just with this is an artist's impression or an architect's impression. They're better than artists. They're actually going to deliver it of what's coming, and within that, there's going to be an instrumented auditorium. So a small 36-seat, last time I looked, cinema, which is going to have all those facilities we've talked about. So we can bring 36 people in, they can watch some content, and we can measure their physiological responses. We can do all the kind of monitoring sort of stuff we want to be. But what we don't want to do is to make that a castle where the only way we can interact with you lot is for you to come to it. It's a base camp for us to go out into Bristol to the various places where stuff's being created and done, and bring that kit and equipment and technology and Bath. Absolutely right. It works so well together. We do actually. That was a terrible thing to say. So it is a base camp for us. It's going to be a new base camp, and hopefully it's a base camp that you will feel you can come to as well and work and collaborate with us in that space. There's also going to be a kind of VR facility there as well. So and lots of other technologies around it, and scientists and computer scientists and engineers, and a support system there to support the kind of activity we can do in MyWorld. The reason I want to talk about this is just to reassure you this is really happening. The builders are actually there making it happen, and it will happen, and it will be here in a year or so's time. And it's going to be a really exciting thing to have in Bristol, for Bristol and Bath. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that was useful. It was a kind of whistle-stop tour, wasn't it? But just to give you a flavour of our approach, the kinds of things we've done, and what we plan to do in the future. Thank you.
Wow, hands up who enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I'm aware we have 10 minutes for questions. There's a question online. And I thought we'd just open the room first, if there are any questions.
Yeah, we're happy to take any questions at all. Or...
This is a really stupid question, I'm sure, but I don't know anything about MyWorld. What is MyWorld?
It's not a stupid question at all. It's a very sensible question. So it's a really large pot of research funding that's come to a group of universities. It's called Strength in Places, so it's very much about, that's why I said Bristol and Bath. And it's a pot of research funding for universities, the Watershed, creative industries, to work on film, TV, theatre, and over the next 5 years to develop sort of new production methods. We're just one work package within it. There's technical work packages, there's a experiential work which we'll be looking at sort of large performances, and we're just one work package within that, looking at understanding audiences.
And there's
a very good question.
There's a training package as well, so lots of training going to be going on.
Yeah.
And there are a set of calls that, if you look on the MyWorld website, there's a set of calls that will be rolled out over the next 4 years, opportunities for people to get funding, support the projects they're interested in, work with us or work independently as well. So.
Thank you.
There's some information under the YouTube description as well. And on the board there, you can find some more information, and you can sign up to the newsletter to find out everything about MyWorld. Are there any other questions? And otherwise, we'll take the question from... Yeah?
I just wondered how much you're using AI in your sort of collation of all the sort of data that you're bringing together, and how much that might impact on your sort of... It's
a big question. Specifically in some of the studies I talked about, we're not, but as a larger project with working with other people, we are, and we could go into examples. I don't know whether you are as well.
So yeah, no, we are using AI. One of the things about many of the methods in AI is they're opaque. So it's not really clear how they're solving the problem. And we are interested in understanding mechanisms. So why is that happening? So we use AI to deal with big data. So many of these methods produce, thousands of data points a second and then millions a minute. And so we do need to use big data methods like AI to process that data, but we always have in mind that we want to understand why. It's not just a question of solving the problem, it's a question of knowing how the problem was solved, if that makes sense. So yeah, it has big implications for this area, certainly.
Thank you. I'm just aware because the question online came in quite early, so I just, if you can talk quite closely to this mic because it's not picking it up.
We've got two questions online. Can we do two, Vanessa? Yeah. All right. The first one's for Danae. It's from Amanda Fawcett. She's asking, how do you test with VR whether it's the content or the form which encourages audiences to self-check or test? And is there a group who experience the works through film rather than VR, for example?
So on the waiting room project, how do we look whether it's the content that we're using rather than than VR? So for that particular one, we didn't have, so we often have control groups. As we're psychologists, we often have control groups and we compare against. So you might compare, something viewed in a different way, like it might be a flat screen film or it might be another piece. For that particular project, we didn't have a control group and we were really looking at the differences between posture and we were looking at just one thing lead to another. But it's a really good question because actually in most of our studies, if there's something comparable, we try to compare it. It's very difficult. If you compare, we were having this conversation the other day that you were always asked, if you're comparing a VR experience, you could be immersed in a book and you could compare that. And we have to decide what our control groups are in those. So it's a good question. And yet a lot of times we use control groups. So we have somebody who's using a different medium and then we compare it. But this particular study was looking at different postures, was looking at the health. So it could be something about the content. It could be something about watching it in the headset. That's absolutely fine. That's something we're reflecting on in our paper.
Right. And we also have another question from Tony Bajam, who asks, when we start talking about tracking heartbeats and eye movements and things, it can all start to feel up in people's personal space. And how do you sort of bring people along on the journey with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point. I mean, when we're doing research studies, we are extremely strictly regulated about what we can and can't do. And of course, part of that is having completely independent review of those studies, and then also making sure that we've got really good informed consent for people taking part in the study, and they understand what's going to happen with their data. And that's how we move forward with this kind of work and building a relationship with our participants so that they feel a sense of trust about what is going to happen to their data, and that's really well regulated. I think that becomes more complicated when it's being used in the wild, if you like, and that's a discussion we're going to have over the next few years with everybody we engage with about how are we bringing the audience along with us, and also how are we going to make sure that the data is secure and safe and is being treated in the way that we said we were going to treat it, and anonymised where possible, of course, as well. So yeah, it is really important.
We have done studies looking at how we make data really visible to people, and so we've done a series of studies where we've looked at trust when we're collecting these sorts of data and displaying it in different ways so that people can see what data that they're giving over and what they might be used and what they don't want to use, and so thinking very much about that. And that's we're looking at responsible innovation of our data right the way through the process on the MyWorld programme.
There are two more questions, and we're very close to time. So I'm going to hand over to Amy and then Tan.
Thanks very much. It was very entertaining. I want to ask is, who do you think the audience is for your work? Not the audience for the work you're studying, but the audience of the research content itself.
So do you mean the audience to use these methods that we're talking about?
Yeah, who is this really for? Is it for makers? Is it for researchers? I'm a maker, so I'm like curious about whether other makers look at this kind of stuff and whether it does actually impact on how they make work, or whether they don't look at this stuff.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a really good question. So it's for the different studies that we've talked at, it's for a variety of people. So the first study that I talked about on synchrony, that was, it's published in an academic journal. It's in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. But we also tried to get the work out in other places because actually, only psychologists are probably going to read that. But then when we're working with the waiting room, we've disseminated in lots of different ways, and that's about, how can filmmakers start working with VR? On MyWorld, we're really trying to think about that working process. So, when I mentioned it could be that somebody, doesn't particularly want to work with us, but thinks, it'd be really useful to use heart rate, and they could come to us and say, when does it work, when does it doesn't, and things like that. Or we could collaborate with, and we might learn things from things that they're doing in their performance. In fact, we've got some people coming in who are using wearables in their performances and talking to us about, this is how we do it, and that isn't how we've looked at it in our studies. So it's sort of two-way like that. But also, like I said, we want to work with some people through the process. They might be designing you might be deciding something new, and you might think, well, actually, I want to integrate these things, and you'll have some ways that you do it that wouldn't be the ways we would do it necessarily in our studies, which would be interesting to us. But we might be doing things that you think, I could incorporate that. And so how we work together on that. So that's what, in MyWorld, we're sort of trying to get that balance, and we're only quite a small team, so we're thinking, how do we do that? So we're working that out as part of the process through this, and we want to come up with a range of ways we can do that, so that we're really integrating all the way through.
I think the thing I'd add is if we don't reach out to those multiple audiences, we'll have failed. So it's a really key priority for us that people who are makers engage with us and benefit from the stuff we're doing. We don't want to interfere with the stuff you make, but if you can see, there's a benefit in me really understanding what my audience response is or not, or this is a way to do it, then that's what we're here to do.
Just looking at the team, because we're at time, but I know that there was another question. Can I? Yes? Okay, great.
So my question is related to Amy's, actually, but I wanted to take it one step further. What do you hope your research is going to be used for? Like, what's the end result? What is the application once you've understood these audiences in this very deep way? What do you want to do? Who do you hope to use it? How? Where? It's a bigger question.
Okay, so the first thing I'd say, it isn't research if you know the answer to that question perfectly, okay? That's not research, that's a factory. I don't work in a factory. The hope is, I can see key places where we make a difference, I talked a bit about questionnaire data being collected by arts organisations in Bristol. I really hope in 4 years' time we'll be doing that in a better way, because we're not doing it in a good way. And I think we have, as a team, got expertise to assist and sit beside those people doing that kind of work and improve the way that those things are done. That's not the stuff you're referring to, but that's one example. But I also think that I would hope we get to the point, which Danae talked about, where we're working directly with someone creating something where this kind of data actually becomes part of the creative process. The audience responds, you all laugh, and then this background colour changes. That's a trite example, but yeah, no. So stuff like that happening would be really great, but also just seeing that we can make the audience noisy again. Okay, so there's a nice story about the fact that at some point in the 1800s, audience were put in the dark and told to shut up, basically. And at the end, the lights came up and everyone could walk out, and then they could chat about what was going on. And I think this is an opportunity is to empower audiences to be noisy again, to talk to the people involved in the creative process. And I hope that we'll see a bit more of that. That was a ramble. Sorry, I was going to.
No, I agree, and I think from our perspective, we want to do lots of studies. I'm excited about looking at more immersive environments and thinking about how people behave in them, and working with more film directors and working with theatres. We've had people engaged through the clusters big project we call the Creative Cluster. We've had people engaged. For example, one of the researchers has been working with the Egg Theatre and looking at their focus groups and sort of integrating as a member of their team so that she can feed into the design and learn how the theatre works. They do really interesting things we didn't know they did. We didn't know that they sit and watch how their audiences interact. We didn't know that. And she's feeding in how we do focus groups and how, so those sort of collaborative working as we go forward, we're really excited about whether that could bring new results from both sides so that we can, obviously we want to publish because that's part of the thing we do, but we also want to see changes, if we could look and, that could change how a performance happens and it empowers the audience and it empowers the performer. That's really what we're excited about. We don't know what the end result is, as Iain says, but it's exciting to do.
I think I have the last question.
Joe.
Hi. And maybe what it actually is a suggestion that we might continue the conversation, because I feel like what's implicit in some of the questions is a concern from people about who else might use the research that you're developing for less responsible things in the world, perhaps. Like a very... a not too problematic version of that might be, Iain, that in your data bias example, Watershed benefits from that data bias in the way that you described it, because actually what we see is more people enjoying the work that we're putting on, and our funders want to see that, and so actually the incentive is for us to be more biased in our data capture. And so that, but I think maybe I'm hearing other concerns around other people out there in the world who are interested in surveillance of audiences for less ethical reasons. And so I suppose maybe we should have a discussion about that another time, because I think we're all really interested in that. But I guess my question is then, how do you hold that responsibility as researchers in the work? Not just in how you hold collaborations and how you do that, but in how you think about how the research could be co-opted by others.
Yeah, so in previous projects, we've had just those dilemmas. So I had a project that was around identity, super identity, and we were triangulating data. So it might be people's mobile swipes, and it might be how they behave in a certain way, their signature. And there are large databases that people put out there for this. And we collected this database in order to do some research to show people the sort of things that you could connect. And that was really exciting in terms of the research, and we published a paper. But when we then asked to publish the database, we thought, that's fun, it's a really exciting one. We had serious discussions about it and decided not to. And the reason we decided not to is not because at that point in time, which was about 4 years ago, it could be used in any way particularly, and obviously it had, but in 5 years and 10 years' time, with actually the advance of particular technologies and the possibilities that could be used, made us decide not to do that. So we're always assessing our work as we go through in every area for those sort of things. Of course, you can't cover everything, but I think those would be discussions that we have throughout if you're filming people or if you're, if there's any sort of surveillance. I think we're very conscious of how we approach that in a responsible innovation form, but actually just in lots of conversations as we go through this and working closely with people to think about those things, because obviously those are on our mind as well.
And I think the thing I'd add is there are organisations which we won't work with. It's simple as that. There are definite lines in the sand. So I think the interesting thing, just a final point about this, is that we've moved in the last 15 years towards open science. And that's been a really positive thing. It's meant that knowledge hasn't been locked in a few universities around the world where there's a paywall to get access to that information. And actually it's a government requirement that our research to a large extent is open. And that means people in other countries, wherever they are, can log on to the internet and they can download our research papers. What that means, of course, is lots of the work is accessible, but the expertise to use that work isn't as accessible, and to a certain extent we still hold control over that. You can read the papers and you can buy the kit to do it, but actually there's a lot of expertise in actually making the thing work and actually getting data and the craft of designing really good experiments and studies, and that still sits predominantly with scientists to work with. So there is a bit more control than it might appear, And actually, we can control that by not working with certain people and being clear about when we're going to let data out into the world. But some of the stuff we do has to go out in the world, because that's a requirement under open science, which generally is a positive thing, but it has these risks, basically.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are probably, I can't imagine that we won't have the other conversations. We need to work that out. But also, give them a big hand. I've got a couple of more things to say, but please give them a big hand first. We are developing some potential fellowships around some of the questions with, in this research. So if you, and I'm directing you again to the MyWorld website where you can sign up, because that's probably where you'll find out about this first. It's myworld-creates.com. So please follow that. Obviously, if you want to stick around today, find a desk or chat to us, we're more than happy. You can come and find one of the studio team. Danielle's there, Joe, Martin, Farah's around, I'm around. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Well, thank you for being here today. Next week's talk is on conversational AI, and we'll be here at the same time. So thank you. Have a lovely day.